Before I actually read the talk that I'm going to read, I wanted to say some things about what I won't be speaking about, because the question of the cultural relations between Kashmir and Tibet is a vast and long one, and in a short talk one can only cover a few selected facets. What is probably best known and most discussed recently, particularly here in India, in the scholarship that's appeared here in relation to this question, relate to the activities of this individual, Rinchen Sangpo, who lived in the late 10th and through the middle of the 11th century. He was a Tibetan scholar from far western Tibet who came to Kashmir in the late 970s roughly, and spent a considerable amount of time studying in Kashmir. And he was a Buddhist monk who was, of course, concerned primarily to promote the Buddhist religion, but as part of that, he spearheaded a great movement in Western Tibet for the refoundation of monasteries, the foundation of new monasteries, the renovation of monasteries, in which he invited artisans from Kashmir into Tibet. This spurred a whole movement of Kashmiri art in Western Tibet that had a long and important legacy in the history of Tibetan Buddhist art. And the best examples of the work that was achieved through Rinchen Sangpo's inspiration actually survive in India, because with the tragic events of the Cultural Revolution and so forth in China, not everything, fortunately, but large parts of that legacy were damaged or destroyed. And in India, we have, for example, the monastery of Tabo in Himachal Pradesh, founded in 996, where the artwork preserve a distinctly Kashmiri style, and perhaps most famously and gloriously in some respects, the monastery of Alchi in Ladakh, where you have this beautiful image of the goddess Tara in a very pure Kashmiri style. I won't be talking about this. This is a fairly well-explored area now. Both Indian and European scholars have contributed very considerably over the past couple of decades to the documentation of these West Himalayan temples in Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, and so forth, that retain elements of this great Kashmiri art movement in that region. And there's plenty of material readily available to read, study, admire, and so forth. I will instead turn to some aspects that have been perhaps less prominent, and in fact, as suggested in the full title of this talk, Pundits and Poets, Kashmir's Contribution to Buddhist Literature and Philosophy in Tibet. Of course, we don't know exactly what Kashmir looked like 1,000 years ago. We don't have photographs, but we do have watercolors, paintings by artists of the 19th century, such as this one. And actually, when I first visited Kashmir in 1970 as a student, it wasn't really that much different than what one sees here, so I thought I would put a rather bucolic image up as suggestive of a almost timeless past. Okay. 1,000 years ago, the exquisite valley of Kashmir was among Asia's great cultural centers, renowned as far as China for its achievements in the arts and crafts, in literature, philosophy, and religious thought. In the refined world of Sanskrit learning, the accomplishments of Kashmiri scholars and writers were appreciated throughout much of South Asia and came to shape subsequent developments in poetry and literary criticism, ritual and mysticism in far-off Bengal and in the Dravidian lands of India's deep south. A paradigmatic example of Kashmir's cultural efflorescence was the great devotee of the god Shiva, Abhinavagupta, a venerable Renaissance man whose prolific writings include some of India's greatest contributions to aesthetics and literary theory, as well as the fullest elaborations of the philosophical underpinnings of the esoteric traditions known collectively as Tantra. Running throughout Abhinava's works is a striking emphasis on the authority of immediate, intuitive, illuminating experience. The appropriately sensitive spectator of great dramatic art, like the insightful adept initiated into the rites of Shiva, is awakened within himself to his own affective and spiritual capacities. The highest art and the pinnacle of religious experience thus are both found in an instant of self-recognition, pratyabhijñā. And though the response to art is fleeting, the profoundest religious experience brings with it a permanent transformation, whereby one may even become a jivanmukta, a soul liberated in this very life. Although for Abhinavagupta this was most thoroughly and profoundly revealed in the esoteric theology of Shiva, in his vision this was not an exclusive truth simply negating the value of other systems of religious thought altogether, but was rather the destiny and culmination of all, so that in his work powerful currents drawn from Buddhist and Vedantic traditions, among others, merge in the ecstatic and radiant disclosure of the Supreme Deity's inmost identity and wisdom. As Abhinava's disciple Kshemendra puts it, summarizing his master's teaching, it is divine consciousness alone, luminous, absolute, and autonomous as it is, that flashes forth in the form of innumerable worlds. In the late 1070s, half a century after Abhinavagupta's passing, a young Tibetan monk traveled to Kashmir to pursue his studies. Although Kashmir did not boast massive establishments to rival the great Buddhist monastic universities of northeastern India, it was known for the excellence of its Buddhist traditions, which drew strength from the high levels of Kashmiri learning and attainment in other cultural spheres. The Tibetan monk of whom I'm speaking was Ngok Lodin Sherab, the nephew of an illustrious Tibetan teacher who had been among the foremost disciples of the famous Atisha, the saintly Bengali Buddhist master who had spent the last decades of his life as a missionary in Tibet, passing away not far from Lhasa in 1054. Lodin Sherab, as the heir to his uncle's distinguished legacy, wished to promote the subjects studied in Indian monastic colleges in Tibet. And to do this, he set out to master the Sanskrit language so as to translate the major Indian Buddhist works that had not so far been introduced to Tibet. Kashmir was where he decided to begin what would be a 20-year journey through the leading Buddhist schools of the day. During his stay in Kashmir, Lodin Sherab met a teacher named Sajjana, who taught him an important text so far unknown in Tibet. The work in question was called The Sublime Continuum of the Mahayana, the Mahayanottara Tantra Shastra, and its author was supposed to have been none other than the Bodhisattva Maitreya, who resides in the blissful Tushita heaven, awaiting the time for his descent to earth, when he will become the next Buddha. And these are all Kashmiri images of Maitreya that are roughly contemporaneous with the period I am discussing. Maitreya's treatise, which had been composed in about the 4th century, taught the sometimes puzzling concept of Buddha nature, the idea that all living beings harbor the essence of Buddhahood within. In Sajjana's explanations to Lodin Sherab, Buddha nature was taken to refer to emptiness, the relativity that characterizes all conditioned existence, which offers an opening in virtue of which the enlightenment of a Buddha is present as a possibility for all. Buddha nature, therefore, was interpreted as the potential of beings to become Buddhas in virtue of the universal relativity of existence. Loden Sherab was pleased with Sajjana's instructions, and on their basis he completed what would become the standard Tibetan rendition of the Sublime Continuum. When he took his leave from his Kashmiri teacher, however, two of his companions, named Sugawe Dorje and Tseng Kaboche, decided to remain behind, to continue to study with Sajjana. In fact, they believed that Sajjana had more to say about Buddha nature, that he had not fully disclosed his teaching about this to Loden Sherab. Sajjana's hidden teaching of Buddha nature departed in some respects from his earlier emphasis on potentiality and emptiness. Buddha nature, he now taught, is no mere potency, but instead is already fully actualized and is radiantly present within all of us, waiting just to be discovered in the intuitive recognition of the true nature of our own consciousness. In this version, known as the contemplative tradition of the Sublime Continuum, in contrast to the exegetical tradition that had been imparted to Loden Sherab, Sajjana's teaching would have a long, complex, and much contested legacy in Tibet, and we shall return to consider some aspects of this later. But for now, let us note that Sajjana's inner teaching of Buddha nature, accentuating intuitive recognition, luminosity, and the nature of consciousness, seems, superficially at least, curiously to mirror the key concerns of Abhinavagupta. Might they be in some way related? As mentioned earlier, Abhinavagupta's accomplishments extended to religion and philosophy on the one hand, and to poetry and aesthetics on the other. Of the several notable figures he influenced, one indeed would emerge as one of India's best-known poets, the Brahmin Kshemendra, whose copious and entertaining writings offer a grand tour through Indian classical literary traditions. Kshemendra composed satires and short humorous works, but also tremendous retellings of the great Indian epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, of the tales of the 10 avatars of God Vishnu, of the abundant Indian Katha literature, and much more. But what is most surprising in the vast literary output of this Kashmiri Brahmin is that one of his greatest works is devoted to the tales of the Buddha's rebirths. The wish-granting vine of birth stories, the Avadana Kalpalata, runs to 2 large volumes, and it begins with an account composed by Kshemendra's son Somendra of how, remarkably, the Brahmin came to lend his poetic talents to the Buddhist cause. And Somendra writes, "My father Kshemendra was a king among poets. Like the risen moon, the beams of his fame delighting the minds of good folk. The first who came to him as a messenger, encouraging him to write all the tales of the Buddha, was a meritorious and joyful Brahmin, the happiness of excellent men. At a later time, the best of his Buddhist friends, named Naka, came to him while he was comfortably seated and said, 'Master Gopadatta and others have composed collections of the Buddha's past lives, compiled in prose and in verse, profound but hard to understand, and elaborated at very great length. But only you are fit to retell the tales of these lives in a delightful, elegant manner, neither too long nor too much abridged.' Following such a request, as courtesy required, Kshemendra began to write and completed 3 of the tales, but then he stopped on realizing that the project would be excessively long. Soon after, though, in a dream, the Buddha himself appeared to encourage him, and he resumed his industrious work on the collected past deeds of the Buddha. The Buddhist teacher Bhadra, well known for his good deeds, wise and greatly learned in Buddhist texts, thereupon settled in my father's house to be as his lamp on the pathways of those profound works. In this way, in his lifetime, he completed 107 of the tales, and I, his son, as an auspicious conclusion, added 108th. In this lovely account, although the names of Kshemendra's two Buddhist associates, Naka and Viryabhadra, are clearly given, not so that of his Brahmin friend, who first suggested the project, but in fact one of the phrases that I have translated as a description, happiness of excellent men, could also be his name, Sajjanananda. Let us recall now that just a couple of decades later, when the Tibetan translator Loden Sherab and his companions came to study in Kashmir, the teacher who instructed them was one Sajjana. Could it be that these were in fact one and the same individual? Is it possible that the apparent similarities between the contemplative tradition of the Sublime Continuum and Abhinavagupta's teaching of intuitive recognition were due to Sajjana's having been, in some sense, an intermediary? Recall Kshamendra's suggestive use of the word messenger between Kashmiri Buddhists and members of Abhinava's circle, as we know Kshemendra himself to have been. Unfortunately, the evidence is just too weak for us to be at all sure about this, but I would very much like it to have been the case. We must be cautious as well about reading too much into Kshemendra's own association with Abhinavagupta. What we know based on his own testimony is that during his youth he was for a time Abhinava's disciple. But as Kshemendra was himself an adherent of the great god Vishnu, not Shiva, it is doubtful that he was a very close follower of Abhinava in ritual or theological matters. And although he in fact does mention studying literature with this master, in his own writings on literary theory he embraces quite a different trend from his teacher's approach. For whereas Abhinava found the essence of poetry in the sympathetic, emotive response experienced in the heart of the receptive reader, Kshemendra was inclined to favor a type of formalism, stressing the virtuosity and tastefulness of refined composition. Nevertheless, he believed that poetic excellence of the type he encouraged would produce, in the suitably sensitive auditor, an experience of aesthetic astonishment, much as Abhinava had envisioned, and to describe this experience, he used a term much employed by his teacher in speaking of mystical intuition, chamatkara, the sudden flash of amazement. Okay, we're going to be traveling beyond Kashmir, so I thought it would be useful to have a map to see where we are. You don't have a pointer, do you, here somewhere? Maybe I can use the cursor. No, I don't. Yes, the cursor is working. Good. You see Kashmir is up here. And so we have Kashmir up here. And then the sort of the main center of Buddhist activity in the period we're concerned with in South Asia, that is to say 11th century roughly and thereafter, is Bihar, Bangla going down to Orissa, present-day Bangladesh around Rajshahi and so forth. You have a number of major viharas. And so we're going to be traveling down that way. And then we will visit some Tibetan centers in central Tibet, in the Lhasa region, and in Shakya here. Before going further afield. A century after Kshemendra composed the wish-granting vine and Ngokloden Sherab studied with Sajjana, Buddhism in India had entered into a profound state of decline. By around 1200, many of the great monastic universities had been sacked, and the royal patronage on which Buddhist institutions had depended through the centuries was greatly reduced or arrested altogether. Under these circumstances, the Buddhist religion, which in India was centered in the life of its monasteries rather than in communities of lay devotees, was increasingly enfeebled and withered. Though the precise situation in Kashmir is in some respects unclear, the region seems to have benefited from its relative isolation, and Kashmir continued to produce Buddhist teachers of note well into the 13th century, and some even into the 14th as well. Shakya Shri Bhadra, to whom we now turn, was born in the vicinity of Srinagar in about 1150. He seems to have spent most of his first 30 years in Kashmir, before a period of extensive travel to the Buddhist centers of eastern India, that I had just spoken about, and a prolonged voyage as well to Sri Lanka. In 1204, he traveled to Tibet, where, known to all as Kaje Panchen, the Kashmiri Pandit, he would spend 10 years before returning to pass his remaining decades in his native land of Kashmir. We are fortunate that his Tibetan followers recorded his biography, which affords a unique vision of Indian Buddhism during the last period in which it still thrived. The summary we find in the biography of Shakya Shri's education in Kashmir is of particular value for the insight it provides into the traditions of Buddhist learning that were still preserved and actively transmitted in and around the valley during the late 12th century. Shakya Shri began his formal training at age 10, and from then until he was 22 was educated as a Buddhist layman. After receiving his monastic vows, he continued his studies in Kashmir for close to a decade more. His first teacher, named Lakshmi Dhara, taught him grammar, poetry, and medicine, and he proved so talented that he attracted the attention of the king and the sponsorship that this entailed. Continuing his studies under the tutelage of a monastic scholar, Ratna Shri of the monastery of Bringi Vihara, he learned logic, the scriptures of the Buddhist canon, or Tripitaka, and the basic elements of Buddhist esoteric ritual. He began then to visit scholars at various Kashmiri monasteries in order to expand his knowledge of Buddhist philosophical literature and of tantric traditions. He completed the higher stage of monastic ordination, that of a bhikshu, at the age of 30, before moving from Kashmir to Varanasi, where in particular he undertook to master the most esoteric of the Buddhist tantras, those of the divinities Chakrasamvara and Kalachakra. And this is a Kashmiri Chakrasamvara. It is clear, though, that during the 2 decades he spent in northeastern India and in Sri Lanka, he was acting increasingly as a prominent teacher in his own right and no longer solely as a student and disciple. His growing reputation became known in Tibetan scholarly circles, and one Tibetan scholar, Tropu Lodsawa, embarked on a mission to invite Shakya Shri to visit Tibet, and this painting, although there are a few uncertainties, is frequently interpreted as an image of Shakya Shri's meeting with his Tibetan disciples, Tropu Lodsawa. And so Tropu Lodsawa comes to India to invite Shakya Shri to visit Tibet. And because Shakya Shri had experienced not long before a dream vision in which he was encouraged to spread the Buddha's teaching beyond India, he accepted the opportunity and set out with Tropu Lodsawa in 1204, accompanied by 9 of his advanced disciples, whom the Tibetans referred to as the junior pundits. The party thus constituted, in effect, a traveling university, who together contributed indelibly to the evolution of learned culture in Tibet. In essence, the 10 Indian scholars, who were masters of the Sanskrit language and its literary and scientific treasures, confronted the Tibetans with the full richness of a Sanskrit classical education and the implications of this for understanding Indian Buddhism, which Tibetans, often reading translations out of context, had been prone to interpret in their own way. Up-and-coming Tibetan scholars were suddenly eager to learn all they could from the team of living cultural treasures they now found in their midst, and so they threw themselves energetically into topics like Vyakarana and Abhidhana Shastra and Chanda Shastra and so forth, aspects of Sanskrit literary education that had not formally been very much studied in Tibet. The legacy in Tibet of Shakya Shri and the Indian scholars who accompanied him may be brought into focus through one of their foremost disciples, Sakya Pandita, the scion of an aristocratic family from western Tibet that was already much admired for its expertise in Buddhist tantric traditions. Sakya Pandita invited one of the junior pundits, named Sugata Shri, to serve as his private tutor for a period of 3 years, during which time he threw himself especially into the study of Sanskrit grammar and poetics, Alankara Shastra, as well as logic. Following Shakya Shri's departure, Sakya Pandita advocated the value of an Indian classical education as he had come to conceive of it, and was sharply critical of Tibetan Buddhists whom he regarded as neglectful in this regard. His insistence on mastering things Indian recalls in some respects the Western ideal of a classical education, with its analogous emphasis on Latin and Greek. Later in life, Sakya Pandita's fame as a teacher spread to the swelling Mongol Empire, and in 1206, with his young nephew Pakpa in his charge, he traveled to meet the Mongol Khan Godan. And so another little look at the map would be useful, because the maps are helpful because they show us just how far the impact of these writers and scholars started radiating. Because we started out in Kashmir, and now we were in Sakya with Sakya Pandita. And Sakya Pandita is being invited up into the center of power in the Mongol Empire up here in this region. And from that, the kind of renaissance in Tibetan Buddhist learning that had been catalyzed by figures like Shakya Shri and their activity in Tibet would now start radiating through the whole of the Mongol world into Buddhist circles in China and so forth and so on. Here is Pakpa. I'm sorry that these images related to Pakpa. They're from an 18th century series of biographical paintings, and I only have copies of them from a Chinese publication of about 30 years ago that's not of very good reproduction quality, so they're not as sharp as I would like. But at any rate, Pakpa became a crucial person in these developments, as we shall see. He was taken by Sakya Pandita to meet the Mongol Khan Godan, and uncle and nephew remained guests, that is to say prisoners, of the Mongols until Sakya Pandita's death 5 years later, an important precedent having been established through this for later Mongol relations with the Sakyapa order of Tibetan Buddhism. This flowered during the following decades when one of the Mongol Khans, Kublai, the famous stately pleasure dome Kublai rose to become emperor of China. And Sakya Pandita's nephew Pakpa assumed the role of Kublai's Buddhist preceptor. And then, with Mongol backing, was made the effective ruler of Tibet. Imperial patronage allowed him to pour new resources into all branches of Buddhist learning, especially the Indian accented arts and literature that his uncle had sought to promote. And here we have an interpretation of him sponsoring the production of books and manuscripts, and that's Pakpa again, right? Among the beneficiaries of this munificence was another of Sakya Pandita's disciples named Shongten Dorje Gyaltsen, who had traveled to India himself to perfect his knowledge of Sanskrit and returned with an Indian pundit in tow named Lakshminkara. And together then they collaborated for some 20 years in Tibet on a new series of translations. The focus was to be the Sanskrit literary works that Sakya Pandita himself had designated as desirable to translate into Tibetan. And according to a much-repeated tradition, Pakpa himself conveyed to the team that it had been Sakya Pandita's desire to seek Kshemendra's vine of birth stories, the Avadana Kalpalata, finally available in a complete translation. And so this became the heart of this renewed translation project. Shongten and Lakshminkara labored together on this throughout the 2 decades of their collaboration, during which time they also succeeded in giving Tibetan form to an imposing body of difficult Sanskrit writings on literary theory and lexicography, drama, and poetics. Pride of place among their accomplishments was a complete rendition of Kshemendra's great work, but they also translated the Meghaduta of Kalidasa, the Kavyadarsha of Dundin, the Amarakosha lexicon, and a great many other works that I think many of you are familiar with. Their translations would have an enormous legacy in subsequent Tibetan poetry, art, and Sanskrit studies. Some 2 centuries after their work was completed, the translator Zhalu Lotsawa would prepare a full bilingual edition of the Vine of Birth Stories that, reissued and re-edited by later scholars, would be for Tibetans learning Sanskrit something of what Homer has been for Western students of ancient Greek. One of the heirs to Zhalu Lotsawa's exposition of the Vine of Birth Studies, Mundro Pandita, would become the tutor of the 5th Dalai Lama, thanks to whom Kshemendra's popularity in Tibet was assured in modern times, and to whom we shall return momentarily. So here you have the 5th Dalai Lama and his Mongol sponsor, Gushri Khan, who was behind the political and material success of the 5th Dalai Lama, and thus behind the renewed promotion of the arts and literature that the 5th Dalai Lama supported. By contrast, although Kshemendra remained always a well-regarded poet among Sanskrit readers in India, the Vine of Birth Studies, owing to its Buddhist subject matter, seems to have had little appeal for Hindu sectarians and was generally neglected. In time, about half the Sanskrit text was lost, and in fact we have a note from a scribe in Nepal in a truncated manuscript that was preserved there, dating to the 17th century, in which the scribe notes that he searched everywhere to make up the missing portions of the text and was unable to do so. It was the bilingual edition published by the 15th Dalai Lama during the 17th century, woodcuts from which have illustrated this talk. All of these xylograph plates I've used are from the Dalai Lama's bilingual edition of the Avadana Kalpalata. It was this that permitted the 19th century Bengali explorer, Sarat Chandra Das, finally to restore the full text of the Sanskrit work to India and to publish it in Calcutta at the end of the 19th century. The 5th Dalai Lama's interest in the Vine of Birth Stories extended beyond purely literary interest. He lent his encouragement to the adoption of the work as a theme for art. He and his successors commissioned magnificently executed sets consisting of 28 paintings, one depicting the Buddha, and the remainder each illustrating 4 of the tales. Here I have to go. This is one of the centerpiece paintings in the series depicting the Buddha. That was commissioned by the 5th Dalai Lama and is now in the collection of the U.S. Library of Congress, a gift from the present 14th Dalai Lama some years ago. During the 18th century, the renowned scholar and artist Situ Panchen, belonging to the Kagyu order and based in the Tibetan Principality of Dege, in the far west of China's Sichuan province, broke new aesthetic ground by commissioning similar sets of paintings to illustrate the Avadana Kalpalata, but painted in the strongly Chinese-influenced style he personally favored. And here you see some examples from sets that Situ commissioned, or that are copies of sets he commissioned. And you notice at once in the treatment of clouds and water and the use of washes and the like, the strong influence of Chinese painting in this material. So we finally have here, if you will, Kashmir blending with China in the imaginal world of an 18th century Tibetan. Situ Panchen, moreover, permits us at last to bring our story full circle and to reintroduce the hidden teaching of Buddha nature of the Kashmiri Pandit Sajjana. Sajjana, you will recall, had transmitted an exegetical tradition to Ngoklo-den Sherab, according to which Buddha nature was identified with emptiness, and a contemplative tradition to Ngok's companions, which found Buddha nature in the innate luminosity of the mind. Whereas the former became firmly established in Tibet's growing system of monastic colleges, the latter was not well received among scholars trained in the fine points of logic and debate. Sakya Pandita, for instance, who had done so much to promote Sanskrit learning and inspired the translation of Kshemendra, had little patience with the contemplative tradition on the topic of Buddha nature. During the 14th century, however, it re-emerged as the basis for an entirely new approach to Buddhist philosophy in Tibet, propounded by Dolpoba Sherab Gensen, a charismatic teacher specializing in the esoteric traditions of the Kala Chakra Tantra, the Tantra of the Wheel of Time. Inspired in large measure by Sajjana's contemplative tradition, Dolpopa identified Buddha nature as the absolute itself, not empty at all, but rather a plenitude of the excellences of the Buddha's awakening. Emptiness, he taught, referred exclusively to relative reality, and for this reason his philosophy was characterized as that of extrinsic emptiness, because the absolute, far from being intrinsically empty, could be termed empty only in virtue of the complete absence within it of any of the limitations of what is relative and thus extrinsic, alien to the absolute's overflowing richness. Dolpoba's teaching was embraced by some, but nevertheless came to be very widely criticized. Many teachers considered it to be virtually a heresy, which they identified as a tacit Hinduization of Buddhist doctrine. The philosophy of extrinsic emptiness came to be definitively condemned under the fifth Dalai Lama, who not only opposed Dolpoba's ideas on doctrinal grounds, but politically opposed the order with which he had been affiliated, the Jonangpa, as well. So it was that the memory of the contemplative tradition all but vanished in central Tibet. The embers never quite grew cold, however, and they began to ignite in open flame anew during the 18th century in far eastern Tibet. Situ Panchen was one of the prominent figures who lent support to the revival. In resurrecting the contemplative tradition, however, Situ and his confrères sought to nuance Dolpoba's view to avoid the suggestions that had led some to suspect that the extrinsic emptiness of the absolute was simply the Vedantic notion of Brahman in Buddhist garb. But for present purposes, I need not tarry over the details of these doctrinal disputes. What was most important was in any case the renewed emphasis on the idea that Buddha nature was to be found in the nature of our own awareness, and that this was to be discovered in the immediacy of a direct intuition emerging in profound contemplation. This idea, in turn, came to play a key role in the birth of a new movement within Tibetan Buddhism called Rimé, the eclectic or universalist movement of the 19th century, that sought to surpass past sectarian animosities, affirming the underlying message of the varied Tibetan Buddhist orders to be one. So it was then that in a setting so far removed geographically, culturally, linguistically, and historically from 11th century Kashmir, as was the Sino-Tibetan frontier of just 2 centuries ago, we find refinements of literature and art still responding to the Kashmiri poet Kshemendra, and the pathways of Buddhist practice and thought still inspired by the message of Sajjana, a Kashmiri teacher to two Tibetans who stayed behind in order to receive his hidden instructions. It seems clear that in the cultural space of Buddhist Tibet, Kashmir's constellation continued to glow long after, at the source, it had dimmed. Thank you.